Welcome to Charting the Course, Navigating the Future of American Naval Power, a podcast series that dives into the past, present, and future of the U.S. Navy and its impact on the world. Today we are honored to welcome Dr. Seth Cropsey, a distinguished former U.S. naval officer, political figure, author, scholar, and president of Yorktown Institute. Dr. Cropsey comes to us with a wealth of experience in naval policy and history, having served as a U.S. naval officer and a former U.S. Department of Defense official. He is the author of pivotal works such as Mayday, The Decline of American Naval Supremacy, and Sea Blindness, How Political Neglect is Choking American Sea Power, and What to Do About it. Seth, how did your U.S. naval career and your experience in the Department of Defense shape your views and perspectives on naval power and strategy?
I was already convinced that the maritime services of the United States and its maritime power, its naval power, is the most strategic instrument in the defenses of the United States. Being at Navy and also having been a naval officer simply reinforced the ideas and reasons for which I was interested in the Navy in the first place, which is to say that it is the most strategic service that we have because it can travel, it can project force, it demonstrates presence. It's a very effective and the most hard to detect part of the triad that defends the United States against nuclear attack. And its global presence has been a major factor in establishing and preserving the international order that we unfortunately have come to take for granted because of the Navy and Marine Corps team's success.
What do you see as the main challenges and opportunities that the Navy has right now in pursuing this?
I think the biggest single challenge that the Navy faces today is that it's been extraordinarily difficult to think through and come up with a naval strategy, a maritime strategy for deterring China and, if necessary, defeating China. And that lacking that strategy, we have a significant issue, we as a country, in understanding what the Navy is for, what it would do to deter Chinese ambitions in the Indo-Pacific, how we would respond, and other very important questions like what kind of force to build. Should we be building more submarines, fewer aircraft carriers, more surface ships, more unmanned vehicles, both subsurface, surface, and in the air? And without a guiding strategy, it's very difficult to answer those questions. I think that's the single largest challenge that faces the Navy today. I mean, there are other ones that are big also. For example, getting the funding that is needed, but it's hard to make a case for funding if you can't say what you're going to pay for. When you have a coherent strategy that you can articulate, you can connect that with the kinds of ships and aircraft that are needed to implement it. And the Navy hasn't gotten there yet.
Why haven't they done that? Have they not laid out alternatives? We're going to fight for Taiwan. We're not going to fight for Taiwan. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. What would go into an articulated strategy?
A very important reason is given in a little vignette that took place toward the end of the Trump administration, where the acting Secretary of the Navy wanted to appoint a commission to examine the future of the aircraft carrier. And after he left the office, that commission was taken away from the Navy and swallowed by the Office of the Secretary of Defense, where it disappeared. And that is sort of a cartoon picture of the problem that not only the Navy faces today, but all the services face, in that legislation commonly known as the Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986 removed powers from the military services and gave them to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the Joint Staff, and the Secretary of Defense. And all of them have used those powers very effectively, which diminishes the ability of each of the services to lay out their idea and implement their idea of what their strategy is. So it's sort of been galumped into a center that is kind of a black hole from which not much emerges, at least strategically. That's a big problem.
So it's really impossible for the Navy to come up with a strategy independently. It's going to be swallowed up.
It's not impossible. It's just hard. It's very hard.
So the Joint Chiefs and the Secretary of Defense have to come up with a strategy, and then the Navy defining what the Navy's part is in that.
They don't have to. They have the power, but there's nobody that is putting a foot at their neck and saying, do this.
So ships and planes are out there, and we'll figure out something to do when it happens.
We'll wait to see what the political direction is, and we'll respond accordingly. That's not getting out in front of the problem. That's reacting.
That's a very interesting insight. How can we fix this?
Well, you can help by talking with people who understand the problem and its origin, and disseminating by spreading the word that the system that we have right now needs to be adjusted a little bit, specifically on the question of the Indo-Pacific, by giving back the powers to the Navy and allowing the Navy to articulate a strategy. That doesn't mean that the Joint Chiefs and the Secretary of Defense are legally or any otherwise bound to accept it, but at least it starts a dialogue, gets something going. Yeah. That's not happening, and it should.
How can the Navy maintain, the U.S. Navy maintain its edge and superiority over its competitors and rivals in terms of size, capability, and readiness, innovation, and technology if they had this strategy?
The tempting answer is to say more ships, more submarines, more aircraft carriers, more airplanes, all that. The reason I don't say that is because of what I just said. And that is the correct response to that is, how do you know how many more submarines to build, or how many more aircraft carriers we need, or how many more or air wings we need, or, for all the major categories, or how much amphibious capability we need, how much logistics we need. And the answer to that lies in, well, what do you plan to do with it? And we're not getting that answer, and we need that answer. I'll give you an example of when there was an answer to that question and how it translated into force development. And that is during the Reagan years, toward the end of the Cold War, the beginning of the Reagan administration, the Navy was seen as primarily an escort service to get supplies to Europe in case of a Soviet attack of a war in Europe. So there was an exercise held every year, the return of forces to Germany. And the Navy's part in that was to part in any war in Central Europe was to make sure that, unlike World War II, that most of the supplies that we sent, men, material, ships, planes, guns, ammunition, all the logistics of war, got there without being torpedoed. The idea was being developed toward the end of the Carter administration and came to fruition in the early Reagan administration of using the Navy differently. And that is to say, to threaten the northern flank of the Soviet Union and the Pacific flanks of the Soviet Union in a way that would draw attention away from the Central Front by putting aircraft carriers and carrier strike groups in the northern seas and in the Pacific, and thereby diverting attention from the Fulda Gap, the Central Front in Germany. And that was a successful strategy. And from that strategy, the Secretary of the Navy was able to argue to Congress, we need a 16-carrier Navy with 600 ships, a total of 600 ships, and here's why. And he had a strategy, and he could articulate it, and he could connect it to the number of ships and type of ships that he needed. We don't have that today, and that's what we need.
Right now, there's of the 11 unified combatant commanders. These are the people that are actually in command of forces, and they are all joint commands. Out of those 11, the Navy has exactly one. The Army has 4, the Air Force has 4, the Marine Corps has 2, 4 and 4 is 8, 2 is 10, and the Navy has 1, which is Indo-Pacific. That's an indication of how the Navy has been pushed aside while other services are really in command of joint forces.
The Navy during peacetime operates about the same number of ships that it would during wartime. It would be larger in war, but it wouldn't be horribly different, wouldn't be tremendously different. So naval officers spend their time at sea, and non-naval officers are more likely to be at forts, at command staffs, are more available for work on the staffs that you just mentioned, the other combatant commanders. It makes it difficult for the Navy to have influence proportional to its strategic importance because it's doing its business, which is running ships at sea.
We used to have better representation on the unified combatant commanders than we do now. What about coordination with allies and those of similar persuasions? Do you see a role for the Navy there?
Big role. The Navy carries out that role to the best of its ability. There are fleet exercises in most of the world's oceans, certainly in most of the strategic places around the globe, the Pacific, the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, the Persian Gulf. And that has always been an excellent way to solidify and develop relations with allied navies. That's all a good thing. And it's easier to send a couple of destroyers to a port several thousand miles away than it is to send a group of soldiers. The ship is in port, it's seen by all the people in the city, and arranging for exercises at sea is an easier task in most cases than arranging for exercises on land. There are very few ground equivalents to the large Pacific exercises that take place every couple of years. Hundreds of ships from different countries.
So if you were going to propose the outlines of some sort of strategy, what's really needed to get to that strategy, that, for example, that we had in the 1980s, and looking for something like that today?
The defense of Taiwan is extremely important. And the ruler of the People's Republic, so-called People's Republic of China, PRC, has made it pretty clear that he wants to swallow Taiwan before he leaves his office for life. And if China were to attack Taiwan successfully, it would have a base that would give it open access to the Central Pacific. And that would place at risk our allies, the Philippines, the South Koreans, Guam, all the islands of Oceania, and ultimately Hawaii. We really don't want Taiwan in the hands of the communist Chinese. So we ought to be thinking about ways to discourage China from even thinking about doing that. And aside from the obvious, and the obvious is arming the Taiwanese with the weapons they need to make China think twice before it tries anything, is to let China know, first of all, we will defend Taiwan if it is attacked. And second, that the price they're going to pay is a blockade and the sinking of their navy. So we're not able to do that quite yet today. And if that were, for example, the declared strategy of the United States, that would give us valuable insight into what kinds of ships we should build, namely submarines, a lot of them, a lot more than we have. That's one example of how a strategic perception leads directly to the kind of fleet that you want to build. We need to do more of that. That may not be naval leaders' preferred strategy. They might prefer to simply break the blockade that China might choose instead of a direct assault. But that's a question for educated, experienced people to discuss. Are the Chinese willing to wait out the amount of time it would take for a blockade to strangle Taiwan? Or do they want results more quickly? And if it's the latter, then they're going to go in the direction of an amphibious assault. In either case, we need more submarines.
This was a question submitted by one of our subscribers. How can the U.S. Navy promote and protect the U.S. value and interests in the world, such as democracy, human rights, freedom, and how can it deal with ethical and moral dilemmas that may arise in its mission and operations?
The best that the U.S. Navy can do, looking at it in the global way that I think the question is to ask, is to help to be a major facilitator, supporter of the international order. And when I say international order, as it applies to maritime things, I mean freedom of navigation. And that freedom of navigation we've protected since World War II as much for ourselves as we have for countries that we don't like. The Chinese have benefited greatly from a world where freedom of navigation is the rule. Freedom of navigation has extraordinary consequences for a country like the United States, which does a huge amount of business overseas and requires ships to bring material here and to send exported goods and agricultural material, all kinds of things there. Imagine what our economy would look like if freedom of navigation didn't exist anymore and we had to fight every merchant ship we wanted to arrive in our ports or to send was in the same danger as Ukraine's ships are when they want to send grain through the Black Sea to their purchasers in North Africa, for example, or Turkey. I think the biggest single contribution of the Navy to a world that is somewhat orderly is to protect freedom of navigation, freedom of transit on the high seas that allows international commerce to prosper.
What can the Americans, for a stronger Navy, what can we best do to help to achieve stronger maritime position?
Ask your congressman, what are you doing about the Navy? Is it big enough? Can it perform its mission in defense of the country? Does it have the resources that it needs? Those are questions that Congress has grappled with, but as a side issue, not as a central issue. That issue, though, is central to American security, to the security of this country. And if your listeners ask those questions of their congressman, even if they're not on the committees that are directly involved, it sends a very helpful message to Congress, and that is people are concerned about it, and events in the world right now are a good reason for being concerned about it.
Seth, thank you so much for your time today and the excellent insights. We certainly appreciate that, and we certainly appreciate all that you do for our country and the United States Navy.
Thanks for the opportunity.